The Phony War, which lasted from the fall of Poland in September 1939 until the German invasion of France in May 1940, was a period of relative inactivity on the Western Front despite the declaration of war between Germany, France, and Britain. While the world's major powers had formally gone to war, the months that followed were marked by a striking absence of large-scale military operations in the West. This uneasy calm led to a false sense of security among the French and British military leadership, who expected the Germans to launch a full-scale attack sooner rather than later. During the Phony War, the French and British armies remained in defensive positions, with the French largely entrenched along the Maginot Line, a sophisticated system of fortifications built to protect France's eastern border from a German invasion. The Maginot Line, named after French Minister of War André Maginot, was designed to be a heavily fortified barrier with underground bunkers, artillery, and minefields intended to slow down any German assault. The idea was that if the Germans attacked through Belgium again, just as they had in World War I, the Allies could stop them at this line, or at least slow them down long enough to mobilize their armies. The British, on the other hand, focused their efforts on naval defense and the Air Force, hoping to secure the skies over Britain and prevent German bombers from reaching the island. British Expeditionary Force, BEF, units were stationed in northern France, ready to support the French in case of a German attack. However, both the French and British forces had underestimated the nature of the coming conflict. Although there were some minor border skirmishes, the most significant activity during the Phony War was the naval blockade imposed by Britain on Germany, aiming to cut off vital supplies. This period also saw the first significant air raids on German soil, as the British Royal Air Force, RAF, launched early bombing missions. However, for the most part, both sides maintained an uneasy stalemate. Internally, the Phony War was also a time of preparation for the coming conflict. The French government, under Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, focused on fortifying its defenses and preparing the country for a war of attrition. At the same time, Germany's Adolf Hitler used this period to consolidate his political power and further strengthen the Nazi war machine. Despite the lack of military action, the tensions were palpable as each side anxiously awaited the inevitable clash. During this time, the public in France and Britain grew increasingly anxious, but they did not yet fully grasp the scale of the destruction that would soon come. The military leadership in both countries felt the pressure to justify the enormous resources they had invested in preparing for the war, yet no decisive action seemed forthcoming. Some historians argue that this period of inaction was a dangerous illusion of peace, as it allowed both the Germans and the Allies to misjudge the other's capabilities and intentions. By the spring of 1940, this temporary lull was shattered when Germany finally launched its invasion of France and the Low Countries. The Blitzkrieg tactics used by Germany in this invasion would starkly contrast with the passive expectations held by many at the time, catching the French and British forces off guard. The Phony War ultimately proved to be a crucial phase in the lead-up to the Battle of France, as it exposed the strategic weaknesses of the Allied forces and the German military's readiness to break the stalemate with rapid, overwhelming force. The German Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, was a revolutionary military strategy that fundamentally changed the way wars were fought and became one of the key reasons for Germany's success in the early stages of World War II. This strategy, conceived and perfected by German military leaders, was designed to achieve rapid and decisive victories by overwhelming the enemy with speed, coordination, and precision. The goal was to break through enemy defenses in a manner so fast and so devastating that it left the opponent unable to respond effectively. Blitzkrieg was not just about moving quickly, but about attacking in concentrated, coordinated forces. It combined the use of armored tanks, mechanized infantry, and air superiority to strike at the heart of enemy defenses. The use of tanks and armored divisions, called panzer divisions, was a fundamental part of this strategy. These divisions consisted of well-coordinated groups of tanks, infantry, and artillery, supported by close air support from dive bombers and fighter planes. The idea was to strike deep into enemy territory, creating confusion and disorganization, while rendering traditional defensive positions useless. The first major implementation of Blitzkrieg came in 1939 during Germany's invasion of Poland. The speed and effectiveness of this new method of warfare allowed the Germans to crush Polish defenses in a matter of weeks, signaling the dawn of a new kind of warfare. What made Blitzkrieg different from traditional warfare was its focus on mobility and surprise, rather than relying solely on large, static battles. The Germans would launch a series of rapid, concentrated attacks to create gaps in enemy lines, then exploit those gaps by sending fast-moving tanks and motorized infantry to advance deep behind enemy lines. This not only decimated the enemy's front, but also severely disrupted their logistical systems, making it difficult for the opponent to reinforce or counterattack effectively. The German Luftwaffe, under the leadership of Hermann Göring, played a key role in Blitzkrieg. The Luftwaffe provided essential air support by bombing strategic targets such as supply lines, bridges, and communication hubs, thereby crippling the enemy's ability to mobilize forces or defend key areas. German bombers like the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers gained notoriety for their terrifying precision bombing, which not only damaged physical structures, but also instilled fear in enemy troops and civilians alike. The Stuka shrieking sirens, designed to terrify those on the ground, became a symbol of German air dominance during the Blitzkrieg campaigns. In the Battle of France, the Blitzkrieg strategy was employed with devastating effect. The Germans understood that traditional defense systems like the Maginot Line would not be sufficient to win the war, and thus they focused on outflanking these defenses rather than directly attacking them. The French had invested heavily in the Maginot Line, a series of fortifications along the French-German border, expecting it to hold back any German assault. However, the Germans bypassed the Maginot Line entirely, launching their attack through the lightly defended Ardennes forest, which the French believed to be impassable for tanks. This bold maneuver caught the French and their British allies off guard and allowed the Germans to penetrate deep into France. The speed of the German advance during the invasion of France was a direct result of Blitzkrieg tactics. German forces bypassed the main French defensive positions and surged forward, quickly encircling large portions of the French and British armies. The German panzer divisions pushed through Belgium and northern France, creating confusion and chaos in the Allied ranks. The Allies were unable to adapt quickly enough to the lightning-fast movements of the Germans, and their communication systems were overwhelmed. Within weeks, German forces had crossed the French border, captured key cities, and forced the French government to flee Paris. Blitzkrieg also relied on the element of surprise and deception. The Germans used misleading tactics to confuse their enemies about their true objectives. For example, during the Battle of France, the Germans launched a diversionary attack on the northern coast through the Low Countries, making it appear as though they were planning a repeat of World War I tactics by attacking through Belgium. In reality, their main thrust came through the Ardennes, where the French had failed to deploy sufficient defenses. This misdirection allowed the Germans to achieve the necessary breakthroughs before the French had time to adjust their strategy. Another critical aspect of Blitzkrieg was the use of coordination between all military branches. The German army here, Air Force, Luftwaffe, and even the German Navy, Kriegsmarine, worked in concert to deliver a fast, synchronized, and overwhelming force against their enemies. The integration of air and ground forces allowed the Germans to hit their targets quickly and effectively, giving them the ability to outmaneuver and disorient their opponents. Unlike traditional warfare, where the Army and Air Force often operated separately, Blitzkrieg sought to combine all military resources into a single, rapid strike force. This new way of waging war rendered traditional defensive tactics obsolete. The French and British, entrenched in their own outdated strategic thinking, found themselves unable to keep up with the dynamic and unpredictable nature of German warfare. The German success in France, achieved in such a short period, showcased the effectiveness of Blitzkrieg and its ability to paralyze and overwhelm even the most prepared and well-equipped adversaries. The shock and awe of the Blitzkrieg tactics marked the beginning of a new era in warfare, with speed, innovation, and technological superiority playing an increasingly central role in military success. In sum, the Blitzkrieg strategy was a combination of speed, surprise, and coordination, employing advanced technologies and military tactics to achieve rapid and decisive victories. It was a paradigm shift in how wars were fought and became the hallmark of Germany's early success in World War II. This approach, built around fast-moving mechanized warfare and the swift destruction of enemy defenses, would shape the course of the war and ultimately lead to the fall of France in 1940. On May 10, 1940, the German military launched its long-anticipated invasion of France and the Low Countries, marking the beginning of one of the most rapid and devastating military campaigns of World War II. This operation, named Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, was meticulously planned by the German High Command, and it aimed to break through the Western Front defenses of France and its allies by employing the Blitzkrieg strategy. The timing and scale of the invasion caught both the French and British off guard, as they had expected Germany to focus its efforts in the east or launch a more traditional attack through Belgium. The attack began with a simultaneous assault on Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, as well as a diversionary attack through the French-Belgian border. The Germans used the element of surprise to great effect. Despite the Allies' expectations that the main German thrust would occur through Belgium, the Germans had no intention of repeating the tactics used in World War I. Instead, the primary thrust of the German invasion came through the Ardennes Forest, a region deemed impassable by tanks and largely considered a safe zone for the Allies. By attacking through this unexpected route, the Germans achieved complete surprise, and the defensive lines of the French and British were easily bypassed. The speed of the German advance was astonishing. The panzer divisions, equipped with heavily armored tanks and supported by motorized infantry, quickly broke through the lightly defended Ardennes, driving deep into northern France. The Germans also employed their Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, to provide close support, bombing key targets and disrupting communications and supply lines. German bombers and fighters attacked railways, bridges, and command centers, cutting off the French and British from vital reinforcements and creating confusion in the Allied ranks. At the same time, the German army made rapid advances toward strategic locations such as the Belgian coast and the French capital, Paris. The German forces were able to achieve an overwhelming breakthrough and rapidly exploit gaps in the Allied defenses. As the German tanks and infantry moved deeper into France, the French and British forces were forced to retreat in disarray. The speed of the German advance was so rapid that the Allies were unable to mount an effective counteroffensive. Within a matter of days, the Germans had created a wide gap in the French defensive lines, and the Allies found themselves caught in a massive encirclement. The German army's ability to move quickly, coupled with its relentless pursuit of the retreating enemy, meant that the French and British were constantly on the back foot, struggling to keep up with the unfolding situation. The Allies, who had hoped to hold the line and resist the Germans in Belgium, quickly realized that the Germans had outmaneuvered them. French and British units were forced to retreat in an attempt to regroup and establish a new defense in southern France. The German strategy was working perfectly. By the time the Allies had started to comprehend the full scope of the German assault, they were already in a state of chaos and retreat, making any form of coordinated defense nearly impossible. As the Germans advanced further into France, key cities fell one by one, including Sedan, which was strategically crucial to the Allies' ability to hold their positions. The fall of Sedan opened the door for the German forces to pour into the heart of France, bypassing much of the traditional defensive lines that had been constructed over the years. To complicate matters for the Allies, the Germans had also launched an attack on the city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where they made use of their air superiority to carry out a massive bombing raid that devastated the city. The German tactic was to use terror bombing as a means of forcing quick surrender, and it worked in many cases. The destruction of Rotterdam was a stark reminder to the Dutch and other neutral countries of the dangers posed by Germany's military might, making it difficult for any of the Allies to mount an effective defense. As German forces raced across the Low Countries and northern France, the British and French forces found themselves spread thin, unable to form a cohesive defensive strategy. The psychological impact of the invasion was also immense. The speed at which the Germans advanced and the suddenness of their attack shattered the morale of both civilian populations and military forces. The French, who had prided themselves on the strength of their military and the fortifications of the Maginot Line, were left reeling in disbelief as their defenses crumbled before the unstoppable onslaught. French civilians fled their homes, creating a mass exodus toward the south of the country, further complicating the military situation. The German assault was not just a military campaign. It was also a psychological and emotional blow to the French people, who had experienced the horrors of war just 2 decades earlier in World War I. The British, too, were shocked by the rapid collapse of the French defenses and the speed with which the Germans overran the Low Countries. British forces, although stationed in France to assist their French allies, were forced into retreat along with the French, making the evacuation of British and Allied forces a crucial element of the unfolding situation. The German strategy was working. Within just days, they had broken through the defenses of France and its allies, leaving them struggling to recover and mount any significant resistance. The Germans, on the other hand, were already thinking ahead to the next phase of the operation, securing the French coast and preparing for the eventual invasion of Britain. As the invasion continued, it became clear that the Germans were on the verge of achieving a spectacular success. The Allies, who had not anticipated such a bold and aggressive move through the Ardennes, found themselves trapped and unable to respond quickly enough. The German forces, once again demonstrating the effectiveness of Blitzkrieg tactics, had already achieved their objectives. The Allies were in disarray, and the German military was well on its way to dominating the Western Front. The only question now was how long it would take for the final collapse of French resistance to occur. The invasion of France had begun, and the fate of the country, and the course of the war, had been irrevocably altered. One of the most crucial and decisive moments in the Battle of France was the German breakthrough at Sedan, a fortified town located on the Meuse River in northeastern France. The fall of Sedan marked the moment when Germany's Blitzkrieg strategy truly began to unfold with devastating speed, and it was a pivotal turning point in the invasion. The breakthrough at Sedan was not just a strategic victory for the Germans, but also a shocking blow to the French military, whose reliance on the Maginot Line had lulled them into a false sense of security. Sedan was considered by the French to be one of the strongest defensive positions on their eastern border. The Maginot Line, which was designed to protect France from a German invasion, had been constructed in the years following World War I to defend against exactly the kind of attack that the Germans were now planning. However, the Maginot Line was a static defense system that was concentrated along France's border with Germany, and it did not extend through the Ardennes forest, a region that was believed to be impassable for modern mechanized forces like the German panzer divisions. French military planners assumed that the Germans would repeat the tactics of World War I and launch their attack through Belgium, where the French expected a large, entrenched defense. When the Germans chose to bypass the Maginot Line altogether and attack through the Ardennes, the French were taken by surprise. The Ardennes, a dense and rugged forested area, was thought to be an unsuitable path for the fast-moving tanks and mechanized forces that the Germans had been perfecting through the Blitzkrieg tactics. However, German military leaders recognized that the terrain, while difficult, could be used to their advantage. It provided a relatively unguarded route to penetrate into France's heartland, and by quickly crossing the Meuse River at Sedan, the Germans could bypass the bulk of French defenses. On May 12, 1940, after a series of preparatory air raids and artillery bombardments, German forces launched a coordinated attack on the French defensive positions near Sedan. The panzer divisions, supported by infantry and air strikes from the Luftwaffe, advanced rapidly and decisively. The speed of the German assault was staggering. In the face of this concentrated onslaught, the French defenses crumbled. The German tanks, which had been organized into fast-moving, well-coordinated units, broke through the defensive lines in a matter of hours. Once they breached the first line of French defenses, they quickly advanced deeper into French territory, leaving the rest of the French army disorganized and retreating. The breakthrough at Sedan was a devastating blow to the French military and symbolized the collapse of their defensive strategy. The French, who had anticipated a prolonged war of attrition, were unprepared for the speed and decisiveness of the German attack. The German forces were not just breaking through the front lines. They were also exploiting the gaps in the French defenses to create massive encirclements. The result was that large portions of the French and British armies, who had been stationed in Belgium in preparation for a possible German attack through the Low Countries, were now effectively cut off from reinforcements and supplies. The psychological impact of the Sedan breakthrough on the French military was profound. The rapid success of the German attack shattered the morale of the French troops, many of whom had believed in the invincibility of the Maginot Line and the strength of their defenses. As the German forces poured through Sedan, panic spread throughout the French ranks. French commanders attempted to regroup their forces, but the speed of the German advance made any organized counterattack impossible. In the chaos that followed, French forces fell back, abandoning critical positions, including the vital city of Reims, and giving up the ground that had been so carefully prepared for defense. Moreover, the German forces did not stop at Sedan. They continued their advance deeper into France, bypassing other French defensive positions and quickly capturing key towns and cities. German tanks and infantry, moving with near unmatched speed and efficiency, raced across the French countryside, leaving destruction in their wake. The French attempt to form a solid line of defense simply could not keep up with the Germans' relentless momentum. The situation grew worse as the days passed, and the Allies, who had already been struggling to mount a successful defense, were further pushed into retreat. The German success at Sedan was also a testament to the effectiveness of Blitzkrieg tactics. The German forces, having already deployed air support, artillery, and tanks in perfect synchronization, moved quickly to overwhelm the French military's static defense. While the French military was bogged down in trying to defend a complex system of fortifications, the Germans focused on mobility, speed, and precision, exploiting weaknesses in the French defenses and leaving them unable to respond effectively. The Germans had not only managed to breach the French defenses at Sedan, but they had also demonstrated the core principles of Blitzkrieg: overwhelming speed, surprise, and the use of combined arms to destroy the enemy's ability to fight back. In hindsight, the breakthrough at Sedan exposed the flaws in French military strategy. The belief that the Maginot Line could provide an impenetrable barrier to German forces was a dangerous miscalculation, as it failed to account for the changing nature of modern warfare. The French military had concentrated too much of their defenses on the static Maginot Line and had underestimated the importance of mobility and rapid response in a modern war. The Germans, on the other hand, had adopted a strategy that was flexible, dynamic, and designed to disrupt the enemy's ability to react. The rapid success at Sedan set the tone for the rest of the Battle of France. The Germans, having broken through the French defenses, now had free rein to advance on Paris and the rest of the country. For the French, the Sedan breakthrough marked the beginning of the end. The speed and effectiveness of the German attack had shattered their hopes of halting the Nazi advance, and the fall of Sedan would soon be followed by the collapse of France's military resistance. As the German Blitzkrieg advanced relentlessly through northern France, the Allies, specifically the British Expeditionary Force, BF, and the French army, found themselves trapped in a rapidly deteriorating situation. The German forces, having successfully broken through the French defenses at Sedan and bypassing the Maginot Line, quickly advanced in a pincer movement that left the Allies with few options for retreat or defense. By mid-May 1940, the German military had effectively encircled large portions of the Allied forces, creating one of the most dramatic and catastrophic military situations of the war. The German strategy of encirclement was one of the key aspects of Blitzkrieg. After the initial breakthrough at Sedan, the panzer divisions, having bypassed many of the static French defensive positions, began to drive westward, aiming to cut off the retreat of the French and British forces. The Germans also advanced toward the coast, where they sought to trap the Allied armies between their advancing forces and the sea. As the German army pushed forward at a staggering pace, the British and French forces found themselves cut off from each other, separated by a widening gap that the Germans were closing in on rapidly. The German panzer divisions, moving with incredible speed, began to push toward the English Channel. These mechanized units, which were supported by infantry and artillery, took advantage of the slow-moving and disorganized Allied forces, many of whom were now in full retreat. The rapid movement of the German forces meant that the French and British could not coordinate a coherent defense. As the days passed, the Germans advanced farther into France, and the Allies' position became more untenable. The encirclement was becoming increasingly difficult to escape. In the face of this encirclement, the Allies attempted to regroup and form a defensive line, but the speed and surprise of the German attack had thrown their plans into disarray. As the Germans tightened the noose, the French army, which had been caught off guard and was now deeply demoralized, found itself unable to resist. At the same time, the British forces who had been sent to assist the French were also increasingly in danger of being trapped. The strategic goal for the Allies was to withdraw to a safe position, but the Germans had anticipated this and were already closing off key routes of retreat. The Allies found themselves with their backs to the wall, with little room to maneuver. In the south of France, the Germans launched additional offensives aimed at preventing any further Allied movements toward the safety of the southern coast. By the end of May, German forces had completed the encirclement of a significant portion of the BEF and French troops near the city of Dunkirk. This encirclement, which came to be known as the Dunkirk Pocket, trapped over 400,000 British, French, and Belgian troops between the advancing Germans and the sea. The situation appeared dire, with little hope of escape or reinforcement. The Germans, realizing the opportunity for a decisive victory, tightened their grip on the encircled forces. They surrounded Dunkirk, cutting off any possibility of a retreat by land, and began launching bombing raids on the trapped troops. The Luftwaffe bombed the beaches, ports, and surrounding areas, attempting to destroy the Allied forces before they could escape. However, despite the German efforts, a remarkable thing happened. The British, aided by the Royal Navy, launched Operation Dynamo, an audacious evacuation plan that sought to rescue as many of the trapped soldiers as possible. While the Germans had effectively encircled the Allies, they made a critical decision that ultimately allowed the British to carry out the evacuation. Hitler, possibly influenced by his belief in the power of a decisive ground victory, gave an order for a temporary halt to the German advance at Dunkirk. This pause allowed the British to organize a massive evacuation effort. Over the course of several days, between May 26th and June 4th, 1940, hundreds of thousands of British and French troops were evacuated from Dunkirk and brought across the English Channel to Britain. While this evacuation was a tremendous success in terms of saving the British Army, it also represented a major German missed opportunity to deliver a potentially fatal blow to the Allies in France. Despite the successful evacuation, the encirclement of the Allied forces had been a resounding strategic victory for the Germans. The French, having been cut off from their British allies, were left isolated in northern France, unable to regroup or resist the German onslaught. The psychological impact of the encirclement and the subsequent collapse of French morale was immense. As the Germans closed in, the French government made the difficult decision to request an armistice from Nazi Germany, signaling the near collapse of French military resistance. The German forces, having successfully encircled large portions of the French and British armies and inflicted tremendous damage, now turned their attention to the final stages of their invasion. The encirclement at Dunkirk, while ultimately allowing the British to escape, highlighted the overwhelming effectiveness of the German Blitzkrieg strategy. The Germans had achieved a breakthrough, encircled the enemy, and taken advantage of the chaos and confusion to dominate the battlefield. The Allies' inability to react quickly enough or mount a cohesive defense had allowed the Germans to achieve their strategic objectives with astonishing speed. The Battle of France, which began as a contest of attrition, had quickly turned into a devastating defeat for the Allies, with the encirclement at Dunkirk marking a crucial step in the downfall of France. The effectiveness of the German encirclement also illustrated the weakness of the Allied position. While the Allies attempted to regroup and fight back, they were constantly undermined by poor communication, insufficient coordination, and outdated military strategies. The Germans, on the other hand, had embraced new methods of warfare that emphasized speed, mobility, and surprise. Their success in encircling the Allied forces at Dunkirk was a clear demonstration of the Germans' mastery of modern warfare tactics, and it left the French and British reeling, struggling to find any way out of their predicament. The rapid German advance in the Battle of France had already led to the encirclement of a large portion of the Allied forces, but the ultimate prize, Paris, remained the central objective for the German military. Once the German forces had broken through the French defensive lines and encircled key positions, the road to Paris was wide open. With French forces in disarray and the British focused on evacuating their troops from Dunkirk, the fall of the French capital was all but inevitable. The capture of Paris, both strategically and symbolically, would mark the final collapse of France's ability to resist the German invasion. By early June 1940, German forces were racing toward Paris, having already made significant territorial gains. The German strategy relied on the rapid and decisive movement of their mechanized infantry and panzer divisions, supported by the luftwaffe, which had provided constant bombardment and air superiority over the advancing French forces. As the Germans approached Paris, the French military was unable to mount any meaningful defense. Much of the French army was either in retreat or trapped in the north, and there was little organized resistance left to slow the German advance. In addition, many of the French commanders were demoralized, unable to stem the tide of the German offensive that had been sweeping across the country for weeks. The German forces, led by General Heinz Guderian and other key commanders, did not face substantial opposition as they closed in on Paris. The French government, meanwhile, was in turmoil. The French Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, had already resigned, and the political leadership in Paris was divided over how to respond to the crisis. Some members of the government, recognizing the dire situation, fled Paris for the southern part of France in an effort to continue the fight from there. However, the situation was chaotic, and there was little coordination between French military leaders and politicians. Amid this confusion, Paris was effectively abandoned by much of its leadership, and the city was left vulnerable to the German advance. On June 14, 1940, German forces entered Paris. The city, which had been a symbol of French culture, strength, and pride, fell without a major fight. The fall of Paris was a devastating psychological blow to the French people and to the entire nation. The once proud capital, known for its architecture, art, and political significance, was now under the control of the German invaders. The German forces, led by Adolf Hitler's personal directive, ensured that the capture of Paris would be a symbolically significant moment. Hitler, who had long desired to humiliate the French and avenge Germany's defeat in World War I, made a point of touring the city to inspect the victory personally. This act of symbolic conquest was intended not only to demoralize the French people, but also to send a powerful message to the world about Germany's military dominance. The fall of Paris also marked the official collapse of the French military resistance. The remaining French forces, although still in the south of the country, were in no position to launch a counteroffensive. The French government, in disarray and with little hope of mounting a successful defense, was forced to consider an armistice with Germany. The humiliating fall of Paris sealed France's fate, and within days, the French government would request a ceasefire, effectively ending any further meaningful military resistance to the Germans. For the French civilians living in Paris, the German occupation brought about immediate and profound changes. The city, which had once been a beacon of freedom and culture, was now subjected to Nazi rule. The streets of Paris were patrolled by German soldiers, and the French population endured harsh restrictions under the occupation. The Germans moved quickly to implement their policies of control, arresting political dissidents, suppressing any anti-German sentiment, and ensuring that the city's resources were directed toward the war effort. The cultural and intellectual life that had flourished in Paris before the war was stifled under the harsh regime. The occupation also marked the beginning of a period of economic hardship and food shortages for the Parisians, who faced increasingly difficult living conditions as the war progressed. The occupation of Paris also had significant symbolic ramifications. For the German military and for Hitler personally, the fall of Paris represented a victory that vindicated their efforts and justified their actions. The fall of the city was not just a military conquest. It was also an ideological victory for the Nazis. Paris had long been a symbol of freedom, democracy, and intellectualism, values that the Nazis sought to destroy. The occupation of Paris allowed Hitler to showcase the superiority of Nazi Germany and to impose the regime's totalitarian ideals on one of Europe's most celebrated cities. In the aftermath of the fall of Paris, the French government, now relocated to the southern city of Vichy, was forced to negotiate with Germany. This led to the establishment of the Vichy regime, a puppet government that collaborated with the Nazis but was technically independent from the direct control of German forces. Marshal Philippe Pétain, a hero of World War I, was appointed as the leader of this new regime. The Vichy government, while ostensibly a continuation of the French state, was heavily influenced by Nazi Germany and had little autonomy in its decision-making. This collaboration with the Germans led to widespread controversy in France, and the Vichy regime's actions during the war would remain a source of division and debate for years to come. The fall of Paris also marked the final stage in the collapse of the French resistance to the German invasion. While some French resistance movements, such as the Free French Forces led by General Charles de Gaulle, would continue to fight on from exile, the defeat of France and the fall of its capital signaled the beginning of a long period of German occupation. For the next 4 years, France would be divided into the occupied zone, controlled directly by Nazi forces, and the Vichy-controlled zone, which, while technically neutral, was heavily influenced by the Germans. The fall of Paris was a decisive moment in World War II, as it not only shattered French morale, but also represented a catastrophic victory for Nazi Germany in its quest to dominate Europe. The German occupation of Paris had lasting consequences on the trajectory of the war. For the Allies, it represented a painful setback, as the loss of France shifted the balance of power in Europe. With France out of the war, Germany was able to turn its attention toward other fronts, particularly its planned invasion of the Soviet Union. For the French people, the occupation of Paris was a traumatic experience that would have deep psychological and political repercussions for years to come. The city of Paris, once a symbol of hope and enlightenment, had been transformed into a grim reminder of the destructive power of war and the crushing reach of Nazi ideology. One of the key elements of the German success in the Battle of France was the overwhelming dominance of the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force. The use of air power, coordinated with ground operations, was an integral part of the Blitzkrieg strategy and played a decisive role in the rapid collapse of France and its military forces. Unlike in previous wars, where air forces were primarily used for reconnaissance or limited tactical support, the Luftwaffe's primary role in the Battle of France was to achieve air superiority and directly disrupt the enemy's ability to respond effectively to the German ground forces. The integration of air power into every phase of the German attack meant that the Luftwaffe had a profound impact on the outcome of the battle, contributing significantly to the destruction of the French and British forces. From the outset of the German invasion, the Luftwaffe launched devastating air raids on French cities, military installations, and infrastructure. The primary goal of these bombings was to weaken the French defenses, disrupt their communication and supply lines, and create a sense of panic among both the civilian population and the military. Cities like Paris, Rotterdam, and Lille were subjected to continuous bombing, and French military airfields were targeted in an effort to destroy the French Air Force before it could take to the skies in defense of the nation. The Luftwaffe's primary aircraft, including the famous Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters and the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, were designed to perform a variety of roles. The Bf 109 was a versatile fighter that could engage enemy aircraft, defend German bombers, and provide escort for ground troops. Its speed and maneuverability made it a formidable opponent in the skies over France. The Ju-87 Stuka, on the other hand, was a specialized dive bomber that could deliver precise and devastating blows to targets on the ground. The shrieking noise of the Stuka, as it dove toward its target, became an iconic sound of terror during the Blitzkrieg campaign. The Luftwaffe's initial bombing raids had a devastating effect on French morale. The French had invested heavily in ground defenses, including the Maginot Line, but they had not anticipated the scale of air assaults they would face. The bombing campaigns were designed not only to destroy French military assets, but also to target critical infrastructure, such as railways, bridges, and supply depots. By attacking these key points early in the battle, The Luftwaffe disrupted the French ability to mobilize their forces and respond to the German advance. The result was that the French military was thrown into disarray, and their communication lines were severed, making it increasingly difficult for them to coordinate a coherent defense. Air superiority was a critical factor in the German ability to maintain momentum during the early stages of the invasion. While the French had a sizable air force, it was outmatched by the Luftwaffe in both quantity and quality. The French aircraft, such as the Morane-Saulnier M.S.406 and the Dewoitine D.520, were often inferior in performance to the German fighters. The Luftwaffe's superior training, tactics, and coordination with the ground forces meant that the Germans could establish air dominance from the outset. German bombers, unopposed by enemy aircraft, were free to bomb French cities and military positions with impunity, further weakening the French ability to resist. In addition to their role in bombing and air superiority, the Luftwaffe also played a crucial role in supporting the advancing German ground forces. The close coordination between the Luftwaffe and the panzer divisions allowed the Germans to implement blitzkrieg tactics effectively. German planes provided close air support to the advancing tanks and infantry, attacking enemy positions, artillery, and vehicles, which created chaos in the French defensive lines. The Luftwaffe's airstrikes helped to neutralize French anti-tank positions, artillery batteries, and supply lines, allowing the German forces to advance with minimal resistance. The Luftwaffe's air superiority also had a significant psychological impact on the French and British forces. The constant presence of German aircraft overhead, combined with the relentless bombing campaigns, created an atmosphere of fear and helplessness. The French, who were already demoralized by the rapid German advance, found it difficult to organize an effective response. The Luftwaffe's ability to strike at any time, with little warning, further eroded French willpower and their ability to hold ground. The psychological toll of the air raids was compounded by the fact that civilians were also targeted, and many French citizens were forced to flee their homes as German bombers attacked populated areas. For the British, the Luftwaffe's air superiority was also a major challenge. Although the Royal Air Force, RAF, had a significant number of aircraft, it was outnumbered by the Luftwaffe, and the RAF's primary role was to support the British Expeditionary Force, BF, as they fought alongside the French. The RAF was involved in a number of clashes with the Luftwaffe, but due to the overwhelming numbers and superior tactics of the German Air Force, the RAF struggled to gain any lasting advantage. The Luftwaffe's ability to keep the skies clear of enemy aircraft meant that German ground forces could continue their advance with relatively little interference from the air. As the British forces withdrew to Dunkirk, they faced not only the advancing German ground forces, but also relentless air attacks. The success of the Luftwaffe during the Battle of France had lasting consequences for both the French and the Germans. For the Germans, the use of air power as an integrated part of their blitzkrieg strategy proved to be highly effective and set the stage for future operations in the war. The Luftwaffe's dominance in the Battle of France was seen as a model for future campaigns, and the lessons learned from this campaign would be applied in the invasion of Britain, the Balkans, and the Soviet Union. The Germans would continue to rely on air superiority and close air support as essential components of their military strategy. For the French, the inability to counter the Luftwaffe's dominance was a major factor in their defeat. The French had invested in ground defenses and were focused on a traditional defensive strategy, but they had failed to adequately prepare for the role that air power would play in modern warfare. The German success in the Battle of France demonstrated the importance of air superiority in achieving military victory. In the years that followed, air power would become an increasingly important component of military strategy, and many countries, including France, would begin to modernize their air forces in an effort to keep pace with the changing nature of warfare. The Luftwaffe's role in the Battle of France was a critical factor in Germany's success, and its influence extended beyond the battlefield. The air raids and bombing campaigns carried out by the Luftwaffe disrupted French morale, crippled their ability to respond effectively to the German ground assault, and helped create the conditions for the rapid German victory. The mastery of air superiority and the effective use of air power in support of ground operations became a defining characteristic of the German military strategy during the early years of World War II. One of the most striking aspects of the Battle of France was the rapid collapse of French morale, both among the military and the civilian population. As the Germans advanced and began to encircle the French and British forces, the initial shock and disorientation quickly gave way to widespread despair. The speed and effectiveness of the German Blitzkrieg offensive overwhelmed the French, leaving their leaders paralyzed and unable to mount a coherent defense. This collapse of morale was not just a result of military setbacks, but was deeply rooted in a combination of factors, including political instability, ineffective leadership, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness in the face of the German onslaught. In the initial stages of the invasion, the French military leadership was caught off guard by the speed of the German attack. The German forces, utilizing mechanized infantry and tank divisions, moved swiftly through the Ardennes and bypassed many of the French defenses. The speed and scale of the German offensive were unprecedented, and the French military, relying on outdated tactics and a defensive mindset, was unable to adapt quickly enough to the new form of warfare. The French generals, many of whom were still steeped in the lessons of World War I, failed to anticipate the effectiveness of the German Blitzkrieg strategy. They had prepared for a long, drawn-out war of attrition, but the German assault shattered these assumptions almost immediately. As the German forces advanced deeper into France, the French military found itself increasingly isolated and disorganized. The leadership of the French army was fractured, with many commanders failing to coordinate effectively with each other. The confusion and lack of communication between different branches of the military led to missed opportunities for counterattacks and disjointed defensive efforts. While some French commanders were determined to continue the fight, others were quick to give up, leading to a breakdown in cohesion and a lack of direction for the French forces. This leadership vacuum was compounded by political instability within the French government. The country was already deeply divided, with various political factions vying for power. The French political system, which was unstable even in peacetime, struggled to respond effectively to the crisis. President Albert Lebrun and his cabinet were unable to make decisions that could unite the country and organize an effective defense. The situation was further complicated by the resignation of Prime Minister Paul Reynaud on June 16, 1940, just days before the final collapse of France. Reynaud's successor, Philippe Pétain, took over at a moment of profound crisis, and he would soon advocate for an armistice with Nazi Germany, signaling the end of any meaningful resistance. The French people, already traumatized by the early stages of the invasion, began to lose faith in their government and military leadership. As German forces advanced rapidly, many French civilians fled their homes, creating chaos and further undermining the morale of the nation. The panic that spread throughout the population was exacerbated by the constant air raids and bombing campaigns carried out by the Luftwaffe, which targeted not only military positions but also civilian areas. Cities such as Paris, Lille, and Reims were heavily bombed, leading to widespread destruction and creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. The destruction of homes, infrastructure, and cultural landmarks only added to the sense of helplessness among the French people. The situation was made worse by the behavior of certain elements within the French military. Some units were disbanded without resistance, and large numbers of French soldiers were taken prisoner by the advancing Germans. The lack of a coordinated defense and the surrender of entire units to the German forces added to the sense of national collapse. The French military, once one of the strongest in Europe, seemed incapable of organizing a meaningful counteroffensive. As the Germans moved toward Paris, it became clear that the French army, despite its numerical advantage, had been decisively outmatched and outmaneuvered by the speed and coordination of the German forces. In addition to the military collapse, the French government was also grappling with deep political divisions. The French Third Republic had long been beset by internal struggles, and these divisions became even more apparent in the face of the German invasion. In the wake of the initial German successes, many French politicians began to question the country's ability to continue the war. This led to a split between those who wanted to continue fighting and those who favored negotiating with Germany. On June 16, 1940, Pétain, a World War I hero, became the new prime minister and, in a stunning move, announced that he would seek an armistice with Nazi Germany. This decision marked the final blow to French resistance, as Pétain's government would go on to collaborate with the Germans and form the Vichy regime. The psychological impact of the collapse of French leadership was profound. French citizens, who had once prided themselves on their country's independence, found themselves under the rule of an occupying power. The sense of national humiliation was palpable, and many began to question how their once proud nation had been so thoroughly defeated. The surrender of France marked not only the loss of a major European power, but also a blow to the ideals of democracy and freedom. In the years that followed, the Vichy government, which collaborated with Nazi Germany, would become a symbol of collaboration and betrayal for many French citizens. The collapse of French morale was not only a reflection of the military defeat, but also a broader societal breakdown. In the aftermath of the German invasion, France was divided into two zones: the occupied zone, which was directly controlled by Germany, and the Vichy regime in the south, which operated as a puppet state under German influence. The Vichy government, led by Pétain, sought to maintain a degree of French sovereignty, but was essentially a tool of Nazi Germany. Many French citizens resisted the Vichy regime, while others collaborated with the Nazis out of fear or ideological alignment. This division would haunt France throughout the war and leave a legacy of political and moral ambiguity that would persist long after the end of World War II. The collapse of French morale and leadership in the face of the German invasion was one of the most tragic and dramatic aspects of the Battle of France. The French military, despite its early successes in World War I, was unable to mount an effective defense against the modern tactics of the German Blitzkrieg. The political instability and lack of coherent leadership further undermined the country's ability to resist, leading to a sense of national humiliation and despair. The defeat of France not only marked the end of an era for the country, but also reshaped the balance of power in Europe, with Nazi Germany emerging as the dominant force on the continent. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, played a crucial role in the early stages of the Battle of France, particularly in the defense of Belgium and northern France. Comprised of approximately 400,000 British soldiers, the BEF was initially deployed to aid France in the event of a German invasion. When the German assault on France began in earnest, the BEF found itself engaged in fierce fighting alongside French forces as the Germans advanced rapidly through Belgium and northern France. However, the overwhelming speed of the German Blitzkrieg left the BEF and its French allies with little time to adapt to the new tactics employed by the Germans, ultimately leading to the encirclement of the Allied forces and the necessity for evacuation. The BEF had initially been stationed in Belgium, in accordance with the Franco-British plans to stop the German advance in that region. When the Germans attacked Belgium on May 10, 1940, they quickly bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line by striking through the Ardennes, a region believed to be impassable by a large mechanized army. The Germans' rapid advance rendered the French and British defensive positions obsolete, and the BEF found itself in a precarious position. As the Germans pushed westward, they trapped the BEF and large numbers of French troops in the coastal area around Dunkirk, a small port town in northern France. Surrounded by German forces, the Allied troops faced the imminent threat of annihilation. At this point, the fate of the BEF and the Allied forces hinged on a daring and desperate evacuation plan. The British government, under Prime Minister Winston Churchill, had to make an urgent decision. With no feasible military solution to break out of the encirclement, the British government opted to attempt a mass evacuation from Dunkirk, known as Operation Dynamo. The plan was to evacuate as many British and French soldiers as possible from the beaches of Dunkirk, where they would be exposed to constant German air and artillery bombardment, and transport them back to Britain. The Dunkirk evacuation was nothing short of miraculous. The British Army, aided by French troops, was able to hold off the advancing German forces long enough for the evacuation to take place. Over the course of 9 days, from May 26 to June 4, 1940, approximately 338,000 soldiers, mostly British but including thousands of French and Belgian troops, were evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk. The operation involved a remarkable and diverse fleet of vessels, including military ships, civilian boats, fishing trawlers, and merchant vessels. These civilian vessels, often referred to as the little ships of Dunkirk, played an instrumental role in the evacuation, braving the dangerous waters and the threat of German air attacks to rescue the stranded soldiers. The air war over Dunkirk was a particularly harrowing aspect of the evacuation. The Luftwaffe, Germany's powerful air force, launched relentless attacks on the evacuation fleet and the soldiers on the beach. German bombers and fighters strafed the beaches, dropping bombs and firing at the soldiers attempting to board the ships. In addition to the Luftwaffe, German artillery from the ground also posed a significant threat to the evacuation efforts. The soldiers, who were already exhausted from the brutal fighting, were forced to endure constant bombardment as they waited for transport to take them across the English Channel. Despite these obstacles, the British managed to evacuate the majority of the BEF and many of the French troops. Though the operation was far from perfect, with many soldiers left behind or killed during the evacuation, the sheer scale of the operation was a testament to British determination and the remarkable efforts of both the military and civilian personnel involved. For the British, Dunkirk represented both a military defeat and a strategic victory. While the British Army had been forced to abandon its equipment and much of its heavy weaponry, including tanks, trucks, and artillery, the evacuation ensured that the core of the British Army remained intact. This would allow Britain to continue the fight against Germany, albeit with a weakened military force. The Dunkirk evacuation had profound consequences for both Britain and Germany. For Britain, the successful evacuation of such a large number of soldiers from a hopeless situation was a morale-boosting event, symbolizing resilience and determination in the face of adversity. Churchill's famous speech following the evacuation, in which he declared, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender," inspired the British people and helped to galvanize their resolve to continue the war against Nazi Germany. Dunkirk became a symbol of British perseverance, and the evacuation was widely regarded as a moment of national triumph in a time of defeat. For Germany, the Dunkirk evacuation was a missed opportunity that would have significant long-term consequences. Despite having trapped a large portion of the BEF and French forces, Hitler made the controversial decision to halt the advance of his panzer divisions, allowing the British to escape. Some historians argue that this decision was made for strategic reasons. Hitler may have believed that the destruction of the BEF was unnecessary and that a more direct assault on Paris would bring about the surrender of France. Others suggest that the German generals, including Guderian, had reservations about halting the attack and that this decision was made at a critical moment when a complete victory could have been achieved. Regardless of the reasoning, the delay in the final push allowed the British to evacuate and escape what could have been a catastrophic defeat. The BEF's survival and return to Britain after Dunkirk allowed for the eventual formation of the British resistance to Nazi Germany, particularly during the Battle of Britain later in 1940. The British were able to regroup, reinforce their defenses, and prepare for the inevitable German aerial and naval assault on the British Isles. The successful evacuation also preserved much of Britain's military leadership, and the soldiers who were rescued would go on to play important roles in future Allied operations. The BEF's ability to escape Dunkirk, while seen as a defeat in tactical terms, ensured that Britain would remain in the fight and that a future Allied victory in Europe was still possible. The Dunkirk evacuation also had a significant effect on French morale. The departure of the British forces left France to face the full force of the German invasion alone. While the British were able to regroup and continue the war, the French, demoralized and isolated, had little chance of resisting the Germans in the months that followed. The loss of the BEF also marked the effective collapse of the Franco-British defense against the German advance, leaving France vulnerable to occupation and eventual surrender. In the broader context of World War II, Dunkirk came to symbolize the tension between military defeat and national determination. The evacuation was a massive logistical achievement, and its success allowed Britain to hold out against Nazi Germany for another year, buying time for the buildup of Allied forces and resources. It also played a pivotal role in shaping the future of the war, as Britain's continued resistance would eventually lead to the involvement of the United States and the formation of a powerful Allied coalition that would ultimately defeat Nazi Germany. The German invasion of France in 1940 is one of the most significant military campaigns in World War II. The speed and efficiency of the Blitzkrieg, lightning war, strategy executed by the Germans allowed them to quickly overwhelm France's defenses, shatter the French military, and lead to the rapid occupation of much of the country. Central to the success of the German strategy was the surprise attack through the Ardennes, a forested and hilly region in the southeast of Belgium and northern France. This route, historically considered impassable for a large mechanized army, played a pivotal role in Germany's conquest of France and was one of the defining elements of their strategy during the Battle of France. The Ardennes region had long been seen by military strategists as an ideal defensive barrier. The French military, heavily invested in static defenses, had constructed the Maginot Line, a series of fortifications designed to deter any German attack along their common border. The Maginot Line, with its reinforced concrete bunkers, turrets, and underground passages, was a marvel of military engineering. However, the French and their allies had assumed that the Germans would inevitably launch an attack in this area, making it the primary focus of French defense. In preparation for this, the French deployed a large number of their troops along the Maginot Line and in defensive positions across the border with Germany. What the French failed to anticipate was that Germany, under the command of Adolf Hitler and his military strategists, would take a completely different approach. Rather than directly assaulting the Maginot Line, the Germans chose to bypass it altogether by advancing through the Ardennes. This decision was based on several factors: the terrain, the relative inaccessibility of the region, and the belief that the French military would not be able to deploy sufficient forces in this area to mount a meaningful defense. German generals such as Heinz Guderian, a key architect of the Blitzkrieg strategy, understood that the speed of mechanized warfare could allow them to break through the defenses, outflank the Maginot Line, and disorient the French. The strategic importance of the Ardennes was that it provided a relatively open route for the German panzer divisions, the armored spearheads of the Blitzkrieg assault. The dense forests and hills, which had been thought to be an impediment to large mechanized armies, in fact provided excellent cover for German forces. The rugged terrain would help conceal the movements of the German tanks and infantry, preventing the French from anticipating or intercepting the invasion. The French military had left the Ardennes largely undefended, assuming that any German invasion would come through the lowlands of Belgium, where the French had planned their defenses and where they had stationed a large number of troops. On May 10, 1940, the Germans began their attack on France with Operation Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, and the focus of their assault was the Ardennes. German forces, consisting of 3 panzer armies, advanced rapidly through the dense forests and narrow valleys of the region. Within days, they had broken through the lightly defended French positions and began pushing westward toward the English Channel. The speed and intensity of the German attack stunned the French, who were caught off guard by the Germans' ability to maneuver so quickly through an area they had assumed was impassable. The German success in the Ardennes was the result of the combination of several factors. First, the Germans' use of armored divisions, which were composed of tanks, motorized infantry, and supporting artillery, allowed them to move at incredible speed. The panzer divisions were highly mobile, well-coordinated, and equipped with advanced communication systems that allowed them to maintain constant contact with one another and with their command structures. The panzer divisions were also supported by luftwaffe bombers, which disrupted French communications, supply lines, and defensive positions, further hindering the ability of the French to mount a coherent resistance. The Germans' ability to quickly advance into northern France and bypass the French defenses left the French military leadership in a state of confusion. The French, who had believed the Ardennes to be a safe haven for their defenses, were now faced with the realization that their enemy had outflanked them completely. The German advance through the Ardennes left the French with little time to react or reorganize. The rapid advance of the German forces, who made full use of blitzkrieg tactics, further disoriented the French command, and their ability to respond to the German threat was severely hampered. Another key element of the German success in the Ardennes was their use of tactical surprise. The German army was able to achieve complete surprise on the French and their British allies. While the French were expecting an attack along the main routes of Belgium, the Germans launched their main offensive through the Ardennes, an area they believed to be difficult for tanks to traverse. The Germans used a combination of reconnaissance, deception, and speed to keep the French and British forces off balance and unprepared for the main thrust of the attack. The lack of communication and coordination between the French forces and the failure to anticipate the German strategy contributed to the rapid collapse of French defenses. The Germans did not stop their advance after breaking through the Ardennes. Instead, they continued their push toward the English Channel, splitting the French and British forces and severing vital supply lines. By June 4, 1940, the Germans had successfully encircled the Allied forces, forcing them to retreat to the port of Dunkirk. The encirclement at Dunkirk marked a decisive turning point in the campaign, and the evacuation of British and French forces, although a success in terms of saving lives, meant the loss of critical military equipment and resources. The strategic consequences of the German success in the Ardennes were immense. The Germans had succeeded in bypassing the formidable Maginot Line and had quickly advanced to the coast, cutting off the possibility of reinforcement or supply to the French and British forces in Belgium and northern France. The German breakthrough in the Ardennes effectively shattered the French defensive strategy and left the country exposed to invasion and occupation. The failure to defend the Ardennes was a key factor in the collapse of the French military and the subsequent surrender of France in June 1940. The German invasion of the Ardennes and the subsequent fall of France marked the end of a particular era of warfare in Europe. The Germans demonstrated the effectiveness of Blitzkrieg tactics, highly mobile, fast-moving, and integrated assaults using tanks, infantry, and air support. The success in the Ardennes also demonstrated the importance of strategic surprise and flexibility in modern warfare, highlighting the inadequacy of static defenses like the Maginot Line. France's defeat at the hands of the Germans would have a profound impact on the rest of World War II, leading to the occupation of much of France, the establishment of the Vichy regime, and the eventual involvement of Britain and the United States in the conflict. The Ardennes offensive also had significant strategic implications for Germany. By securing a rapid victory in France, Hitler and the Nazi leadership were able to focus their attention on other military objectives, most notably the invasion of Britain and the Eastern Front. However, despite the initial success of the Ardennes attack, the rapid advances made by the Germans would soon lead to overextension and logistical challenges, particularly during the planned invasion of the Soviet Union, which would ultimately prove to be one of the major turning points in the war. The lessons learned from the Ardennes offensive, however, would inform German military strategy throughout the war, and the use of fast-moving armored divisions would continue to be a key component of Blitzkrieg tactics. In the end, the German invasion of the Ardennes is remembered as one of the most remarkable feats of military strategy in history, demonstrating the power of mechanized warfare and strategic surprise. The success of the German forces in this region, which was thought to be impassable, marked the beginning of the end for France and set the stage for the remainder of the war in Europe. The aerial dimension of the Battle of France played a decisive role in the outcome of the campaign, with the German luftwaffe establishing near-total air superiority over the French and British forces. The Germans' effective use of air power in support of their ground forces marked a key aspect of their Blitzkrieg tactics, facilitating rapid advances, disrupting enemy communications, and causing widespread panic among both military personnel and civilians. In contrast to the French, who were still relying on outdated aviation strategies, the Germans integrated their air force seamlessly into their overall battle plan, giving them a significant edge. The Luftwaffe's success in dominating the skies over France contributed to the swift collapse of French defenses and played a crucial role in the destruction of the French military's ability to resist the German invasion. The German Luftwaffe, led by Hermann Göring, was a highly organized and efficient air force, far more advanced than the French Air Force, Armée de l'Air, at the time. The Luftwaffe's tactics were highly coordinated with the ground forces, allowing for rapid and devastating strikes on French defensive positions, troop concentrations, and transportation networks. The Germans employed specialized units such as the Stuka dive bombers, which were designed for close air support and could deliver highly accurate and devastating bombs on enemy positions. These bombers were a hallmark of the Blitzkrieg strategy, as they could disrupt enemy formations, create chaos among troops, and prevent the French from regrouping or organizing coherent resistance. In addition to the Stuka bombers, the Luftwaffe also relied heavily on fighter aircraft such as the Messerschmitt Bf 109, which was one of the most advanced and effective fighters of the time. The Bf 109 gave the Germans a significant advantage in aerial combat, as it was fast, well-armed, and able to outmaneuver many of the aircraft employed by the French. The Luftwaffe also used long-range reconnaissance planes, such as the Heinkel He-111, to scout out French positions and provide valuable intelligence to the German command. This level of integration between air and ground forces was something the French were unable to replicate, leaving them at a distinct disadvantage in the battle for control of the skies. One of the key aspects of the Luftwaffe's success during the Battle of France was its ability to establish air superiority early in the conflict. The German Air Force quickly gained control of the skies over Belgium and northern France, making it nearly impossible for the French and British air forces to mount any effective resistance. As the German panzers advanced, the Luftwaffe provided close air support, strafing French infantry positions, destroying artillery emplacements, and bombing supply depots. This air superiority allowed the Germans to maintain the momentum of their ground forces and prevent any organized French counterattacks or effective mobilization of reserves. The French, on the other hand, found themselves in a difficult position when it came to air combat. The French Air Force was considerably smaller and less advanced than the Luftwaffe, and many of their aircraft were outdated or not properly suited for the modern warfare tactics being employed by the Germans. The French also lacked the same level of coordination between their air and ground forces. While the French had some modern aircraft, such as the D-Woitin D.520 and the Morane-Saulnier AM.S.406, many of these planes were outclassed by the German Bf 109 and were unable to gain the upper hand in dogfights. Additionally, the French Air Force was plagued by logistical problems, such as poor communication and coordination, which prevented it from mounting a cohesive defense against the German air onslaught. One of the most notable aspects of the German air campaign during the Battle of France was the systematic bombing of French cities and industrial centers. The Luftwaffe used its bombers to target critical infrastructure, including railways, factories, and power plants, crippling the French ability to move troops, supplies, and equipment. The bombing of French cities also had a psychological effect, causing panic and weakening morale among both civilians and military personnel. The destruction of critical infrastructure hampered French efforts to respond to the German invasion and further impeded the effectiveness of their defense. The Luftwaffe's success in establishing air superiority also had a profound impact on the outcome of the Dunkirk evacuation. As the British and French forces were retreating to the coast, they faced not only the advancing German army, but also relentless attacks from the Luftwaffe. The German bombers and fighters targeted the beaches, the evacuation vessels, and the port facilities at Dunkirk, causing heavy casualties and damaging vital infrastructure. The British had to contend with both German ground forces and the Luftwaffe, making the evacuation even more challenging. However, despite the German aerial bombardment, the British were able to evacuate a significant portion of their forces, although many soldiers were killed or wounded in the process. In addition to their bombing campaigns and air superiority, the Germans also used their air forces for psychological warfare. The constant threat of air raids, the sound of German bombers overhead, and the terrifying sight of Stuka dive bombers diving on their targets created an atmosphere of fear and chaos. The psychological impact of the German air assault was not limited to the military. Civilians were also deeply affected by the constant bombings. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed, and the population was forced to live in constant fear of air raids. This sense of vulnerability and terror further demoralized the French and contributed to the rapid collapse of French resolve during the Battle of France. While the French did make some attempts to defend their airspace, these efforts were often uncoordinated and ineffective. The French Air Force did manage to score some successes against the Luftwaffe, particularly in the early days of the conflict. However, these successes were limited, and the French were ultimately unable to mount a sustained defense against the German aerial onslaught. The French did have some air units that were able to engage the Luftwaffe in combat, such as the famous Group de Chasse 17 Les Sagagnes, which had some notable victories. However, these victories were often isolated incidents, and the overall effectiveness of the French air forces was insufficient to turn the tide of the battle. The Battle of France also demonstrated the importance of air power in modern warfare. The ability to control the skies provided the Germans with a significant tactical advantage, allowing them to conduct bombing raids, destroy supply lines, and disrupt enemy communications. The integration of air power into the Blitzkrieg strategy was a game-changer, and it was one of the key reasons for the swift success of the German invasion. In contrast, the French reliance on outdated defensive strategies and the lack of coordination between their air and ground forces left them vulnerable to German air superiority. In the aftermath of the Battle of France, the Luftwaffe's dominance in the skies would continue to play a central role in the German strategy. The experience gained during the campaign, particularly in terms of tactical coordination with ground forces and the use of air power for psychological and strategic purposes, would be applied during future operations, including the invasion of the Soviet Union and the Battle of Britain. The Battle of France highlighted the critical importance of air superiority in modern warfare, a lesson that would shape military strategies for years to come. For the Allies, the defeat in France underscored the need to develop a more effective air force and to learn from the German tactics that had proven so successful. The fall of France in June 1940 marked one of the most dramatic and rapid collapses in military history, signaling the end of the French Third Republic and paving the way for a new political entity, Vichy France. The events following France's surrender to Nazi Germany were deeply consequential, not only for France itself, but for the wider geopolitical landscape of World War II. France's defeat had far-reaching consequences for the Allied powers, and the establishment of the Vichy regime dramatically altered the political situation in Europe and set the stage for the continuation of the war in the coming years. On June 22, 1940, after just 6 weeks of fighting, the French government, under pressure from the advancing German forces, signed an armistice with Nazi Germany. The terms of the armistice were harsh. France was divided into two zones, with the northern and western parts of the country, including Paris, occupied by German troops. The southern part of France, which was largely unoccupied, was governed by a new regime based in the city of Vichy. This regime, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, a World War I hero who was appointed chief of state, collaborated with Nazi Germany and effectively became a puppet government under German control. The establishment of the Vichy government was a significant political development in the aftermath of the fall of France. Pétain and his supporters portrayed the Vichy regime as a temporary solution, with the goal of maintaining order in the southern part of France and negotiating a peace settlement with Germany. However, in reality, the Vichy regime became increasingly aligned with Nazi ideology, implementing policies that included the persecution of Jews, the suppression of political opposition, and the collaboration with the Nazis in their efforts to control Europe. The fall of France was a devastating blow to the morale of the French population, and the political consequences were profound. The establishment of the Vichy regime created deep divisions within France, as many French citizens and political leaders resisted collaboration with the Nazis, while others supported it. The question of collaboration versus resistance became a central issue throughout the remainder of the war, with the Vichy government serving as a symbol of France's divided loyalty. The Vichy government also faced significant challenges in maintaining control over France, as the resistance movements, both internal and external, began to gain momentum. The French resistance, consisting of various groups that opposed Nazi occupation and the Vichy regime, carried out acts of sabotage, intelligence gathering, and attacks on German forces. These resistance movements were critical in disrupting German operations in France and providing valuable intelligence to the Allies. The rise of the resistance was one of the key factors that ultimately undermined the legitimacy of the Vichy regime and contributed to its eventual downfall. On the international stage, the fall of France had significant consequences for the balance of power in Europe. With France out of the war, Nazi Germany now controlled most of Western Europe, and Britain was left as the last major Allied power standing against the Axis. The German victory in France, combined with the fall of Belgium and the Netherlands, left Britain isolated and vulnerable. However, the British, under Prime Minister Winston Churchill, refused to surrender and instead focused on mounting a defense of their island nation. The Battle of Britain, which took place later in 1940, would become a critical turning point in the war, as the Royal Air Force successfully repelled the German Luftwaffe and prevented a German invasion of Britain. The fall of France also had profound consequences for the United States, which at the time had not yet entered the war. The rapid collapse of the French military and the fall of one of the Allies' major powers raised concerns about the future of the fight against the Axis powers. For the United States, the loss of France underscored the urgency of assisting Britain and preparing for a potential entry into the war. The events of 1940 would lead to increased American support for Britain, culminating in the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the United States to provide military aid to Britain and other Allied nations. In the wake of France's fall, the German occupation of France also had significant economic consequences. The Germans exploited the country's resources to support their war effort, taking control of French industries, agricultural output, and infrastructure. The Nazis also used France as a base for launching further military operations, including the eventual invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. The occupation also led to widespread economic hardship for the French population, as the Germans imposed harsh requisitions, forced labor, and economic exploitation. The occupation of France was not limited to the economic realm. It also had significant cultural and social implications. The French population lived under constant surveillance, with the German occupiers implementing strict measures to suppress any form of resistance. The Vichy regime, with its authoritarian policies, sought to maintain control through censorship, propaganda, and the use of the police force, which was often complicit in carrying out the Nazis' orders. The French people were subjected to a brutal occupation, with widespread repression, arbitrary arrests, and the deportation of Jews and other minorities to Nazi concentration camps. The collaboration between the Vichy regime and Nazi Germany also extended to the military realm. The French military, which had been defeated and humiliated by the Germans, was forced to cooperate with the Nazis in various ways, including providing manpower for German military operations. The Vichy government collaborated with the Nazis in the deportation of Jews, the suppression of resistance movements, and the maintenance of order in the occupied territories. This collaboration created a sense of betrayal and led to intense political polarization within France. The fall of France also had lasting consequences for the broader European resistance movement. The defeat of the French army and the establishment of the Vichy regime created a vacuum of power in much of Western Europe. Many of the countries that had been invaded by Nazi Germany, including Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway, saw the rise of resistance movements that sought to disrupt German operations and liberate their countries from occupation. The French resistance, in particular, would go on to become one of the most important and effective resistance movements in Europe, providing critical support to the Allies during the war. On the global stage, the defeat of France marked the beginning of a new phase in the war. The Nazi occupation of France and the establishment of the Vichy regime solidified Germany's dominance over much of Europe. However, it also spurred the formation of new alliances and resistance movements, which would eventually lead to the downfall of Nazi Germany. The fall of France was a critical moment in the early stages of World War II, but it was also the beginning of a long and difficult struggle that would ultimately result in the liberation of France and the defeat of the Axis powers. In conclusion, the Battle of France in 1940 was a pivotal moment in the early stages of World War II, marking not only the swift defeat of one of the world's most powerful military forces, but also the beginning of a new, darker chapter in European history. While the fall of France seemed to signal the triumph of Nazi Germany, it also ignited the flames of resistance, both within France and across Europe, that would prove essential in the fight against tyranny. The formation of Vichy France and the subsequent German occupation underscored the resilience of the human spirit, as brave men and women, driven by an unwavering desire for freedom, rose to challenge the oppressors. The Battle of France serves as a powerful reminder that while military might may conquer territory, it cannot break the resolve of those determined to resist. The lessons from France's collapse, the perseverance of its people, and the eventual liberation of the country in 1944 are a testament to the enduring power of hope, unity, and the collective strength of the Allied nations. As we reflect on this critical moment in history, We honor the sacrifices made and reaffirm our commitment to ensuring that the dark days of oppression are never repeated. Thank you.